Chapter 14, Biting the Wrong Hand. I wrote many articles for a monthly newsletter, which are now appearing in some form in this book. But at the time, we struggled along trying to build a church out of the remnants of that old historic mess in that dilapidated and broken neighborhood. I'm an analyzer and a synthesizer by nature. My creative mind simply finds ways to examine situations, assess the needs, and explore ideas for possible outcomes and solutions to whatever systematic problem exists. In this case, I was wrestling with how to build an effective church in such a place and under such conditions. We were failing at church, even if we were doing well at ministry. I couldn't get people to come. We couldn't build any effective outreach programs to people of substance who could come and support the work with ties and talents. Our church was losing money heavily and burning through the last remainder of the parsonage sale money, no matter what I tried to do to stop the blood flow. I became quite the real estate entrepreneur. We found ways to raise monthly cash flow by renting extra unused rooms to jazz bands for rehearsal space. I had contracts with a parking company to get revenue off our parking lot, but had to come up with a striping plan to add 20 spaces. We rented ourselves out to weekly events for other nonprofits who wanted to use our prime location for outreach to the poor. I was constantly finding ways to generate revenue through use of our office space or rental of our facility, but it was never enough. At one point, we were bringing in more than $2,000 a month from rental space alone, but it seemed like no matter how many contracts I negotiated, drafted, and signed, it was never enough. For every contract I gained, we seemed to lose that much in giving. It was climbing uphill on a sand dune. At one point, I thought the only solution for a downtown urban church is for a local megachurch or a denomination to take on the facility and work with the poor. Either of those would have the thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of dollars of income, millions more likely, that could take on the finances of the building. They would have the means to hire a location pastor to do outreach and send their people down to the urban location to hand out food, give away blankets, pass out hats and gloves, befriend the poor, and share their stories of faith and hope. A denomination could have several outlying suburban churches adopt an inner-city church as their mission outpost project. Either way, when the megachurch or denomination talked to their people about the poor, they could say, "Go down there to our guy in the trenches. That's where we do it. That's where the work is sustained. And that's where we connect you to your local poverty scene." With that in mind, and because our church was running out of money so fast that we had less than a year of life, I emailed a local large church pastor whom I had met to consider taking 100 or so of their people and seeding a congregation work in our location. We were dead in the water anyway, and I was planning on moving on to do something else with my life. Usually, when you contact a large church pastor, you get no response. When you do, it often takes several months to make personal contact and to set up a meeting. Well, that's what I was expecting. To my surprise, he got back to me right away and set up a meeting within the week. They were good at church planting, so I was hoping the conversation would be about them peeling off a group of their folks who cared about ministry to the poor and incubate something in our dying facility, and I would move on. But he was coming to set me straight. He was nice and kind and all, but there was some kind of tension in the air I couldn't figure out. He brought his full-time ministry associate, whose job was to find ministries to plug their people into for outreach works for social justice and poverty. It was one of those conversations where you know you're talking about a subject, but you have the distinct impression that the other person has an entirely different aim or agenda for the meeting, but you can't figure out what it is. I have a habit to keep on talking, hoping to stumble upon whatever the real deal is. Sometimes it works, sometimes it backfires. At one point in the conversation, I was asked rather directly what kind of training I intended to provide for their people so that they would be prepared to minister to the poor if they came down here. I kind of snapped inside at that point, but I stayed cool on the outside. My head was reeling. This guy had a paid staff almost as big as my entire church. He had a full-time person who was sitting right beside him whose only job was to place their people in works of charity. But he wanted me to do the training for his people? My wife and I didn't get no stinking training. Badges? We don't got no stinking badges. We just showed up and got moving. Nowadays, if someone asked me, I could cover a couple hours worth of information about all I've learned about poverty people and poverty culture, but I still wouldn't call that training. Wisdom and knowledge gained by experience, but not really training. Since the resignation of the former pastor and my assuming full leadership as a solo pastor, my duties included sermon preparation and preaching, counseling, service planning, worship leading, creative arts and video preparation, band rehearsals, brochure and bulletin production, business management, board meetings, record keeping of those meetings, computer repair and maintenance, janitorial oversight, leadership for feeding 150 homeless people per week, office management, crisis counseling, oversight of building maintenance, copy machine work, purchase of all office supplies and ministry-related materials, building relationships with the business and social services community around us, grant writing, fundraising, contract negotiating, and developing outreach and church growth strategies. My wife had offered to help me since I was the lone employee of the church. She volunteered some 30 to 40 hours per week in the church office, along with her other duties as coffee ministry coordinator, nursery leader, kitchen manager, and supply procurer for the homeless feeding program. Since the worship team consisted of only me and my guitar, my 2 teenage daughters singing, and my 13-year-old son on the soundboard, and one other couple, one of whom plays percussion and the other who runs PowerPoint up in the booth, I had begun to consider worship rehearsal as quality family time. He was asking me to add training his people to work with the poor to my plate. There was an implication hanging in the air that these two were assessing whether our ministry was worthy of their blessing based on whether I was an incompetent and unprepared leader. I didn't lean in. I leaned back. Taking a deep breath, I slowly and deliberately explained, "Well, Pastor, I think that if your people have been attending your church and listened to you preach every week for the last 3 or 4 years, if they've been attending their small group, which you encourage them to join, and if they've been studying the Bible every week in someone's living room for the last year or two, and if they've taken any of the many classes or workshops your church offers, then they're trained." I finished a touch dramatic. The conversation ended shortly thereafter. On the way out the door, while standing on the steps of our church, the last thing he said to me was, "You need to learn not to bite the hand that feeds you." I thought those were strange words from a pastor whose church had not given us a single dime to buy so much as one styrofoam coffee cup. But my brain wasn't working very well at the moment because all I could think of was my friend Mike in Arizona who was financing us. Mike had been through a very bad divorce and was living in his parents' basement at midlife while he tried to rebuild himself. He was working as a computer tech, but also had a side business selling dirty banana drink mix, a banana chocolate concoction, to the bars and the strip clubs in Vegas. He was our biggest financial contributor at the time. I was never sure how to even pray for that one. A couple of this large church pastor's small groups had served in our meals many months earlier and given us some money for the meals, but Mike alone had given us 3 to 4 times the amount of those contributions combined. I just smiled confusedly. I stood on the steps and I waved goodbye as they drove off. I never spoke to them again. I found out a few days later why he responded so quickly to meeting me. An associate staff member called me up extremely angry and read me the riot act over the phone over my newsletter article about looking up at the underbelly of the American church. At the time, my newsletter article, it went out to only 60 people, 40 of whom lived out of state. Their staff had seen the article a few weeks prior, and they decided the whole thing was all about their church, which it wasn't since I'd never worked at their church, obviously. I'm sure I got that one wrong. Maybe Mike and I are all backwards. Maybe funding efforts that one believes in that aren't very big, flashy, influential, or super organized are a waste. Maybe all that Bible study and sermon listening isn't good enough. Maybe I should have created a training program for their people. Maybe just jumping and doing something, anything, even if you don't know what you're doing, is a terrible idea after all. But then again, what do I know? After all, I'm crazy.